I want to thank you, Sam. You're heading a lot of this meeting, and I want to thank all of you for coming. People from different parts of my life are not yet part of my life, so I welcome you all here. I was trying to integrate how I got from one place to another, how I got from pure academic scholarship, all within being a speaker, but to the end point of, at least at the point where I've written my last books. So I just wanted to share a little bit of that type of a journey with you so that you could see some of the different things that I was concerned with and why I was concerned with them. So it's always hard when you look back over your life to try to pinpoint a certain point of origination or a stimulus point. But I would say that one of the stimuli when I was early in college was my first reading of Ernst Cassirer's Philosophy of Symbolic Forms. This had a remarkable impact upon me, and the first encounter with the notion of the creative structuring of creativity around certain symbolic structures and the way they mediate between experience and the world and create new forms of thinking within them. Within Cassirer's great work, really a kind of a product of neo-Kantian thought, the two of the three volumes made a particularly powerful impression on me and served as kind of launching of many other interests. One was, of course, the volume on language and the place of language in the articulation of the self, and the way language itself is a symbolic form through different kinds of prisms of creativity. And of course, his second great volume was on myth or mythopoeic thought. When Mona and I first met on our first date, I was driving her back from Wellesley. She asked me what I was working on, and I said I was working on mythopoeic thought and subsurface culture. Well, that sort of ruined it for a while. It's not a way to win friends and a future wife. But that was sort of the core. The mythopoeic thought really was part of the power of the creative imagination, the narrativization of the creative imagination, and seeing the imagination as a form of rationality, not a scientific rationality, not a structuring rationality, but its own type of logic that moved from narrative form to a certain type of subjectivity. Some of that came together, both some of Cassirer's students, like Suzanne Langer, philosophy of Nuki, who was a student of Whitehead. These were all important. And in those days, many of you may remember that book called Before Philosophy, the great chapter on Mesopotamian thought by Torkel Jakobsen, who was at the Oriental Institute, and I almost became a Assyriologist at Harvard because of that. But it was a lot of different kinds of integrations. But the point that I want to first stress was this interest in symbolic forms as forms of human and religious creativity that themselves undergo a variety of interpretations. Well, I became aware at a certain point of the highly, what we call ideal in the philosophical sense, or the mentalistic aspect of symbolic forms, and I determined myself that I really needed to begin prior to that at the philological level, and to begin the process of studying the languages. And I really began as a student of the ancient Near East biblical studies and learning all the ancient Near Eastern languages as a philological exercise to begin to try to start at the beginning and to see how those symbolic forms begin to unfold and begin to express themselves. And I certainly realized, I didn't quite realize at that point that these materials were themselves features of the mentality of our own day, and I really thought that I could begin uncovering the true biblical mentality and the ancient Near Eastern mentality and so on. But I realized at a certain point how much the scholar and the scholar's cognitive and imaginative world was an effect of that. But the process from that point on gave me a whole arc of decades and books that would have to be characterized as historical theology. And the thing that captured my imagination in historical theology from the beginning was the process of the way texts were received and transformed, and cultures were always on this hermeneutical process of making, expanding, and growing. So at least in this process, it began with one of my first books that made an impact, and that was Biblical Interpretation in Ancient Israel, where the question I really posed myself was, where did rabbinic interpretation come from, and where did it begin? And I discovered really that in the Hebrew Bible itself, there's a whole vast network before the canon of living oral interpretations that were growing. So this process of historical theology, beginning with the Bible in the context of the ancient Near East, and then gradually within Midrash and its place within the Greco-Roman world, and my interest in medieval thought and its place within medieval philosophy or Neoplatonic thought, and so on in the modern period, all of this became part of my passion for historical theology, to be aware of how the human spirit is constantly transforming itself, but doing it over against an unfolding nature of tradition, that the tradition is not fixed, it's not something stable, but it is constantly being transformed through the creative imagination, and that the interpretive forms are really these kinds of symbolic and cultural forms that generate the culture, which kind of live on this arc between basic text with the scripture and then these remarkable interpretations over the course of 2,000 years. And one of the things that most fascinated me was really what we might call this kind of angle of difference or dissonance, how the biblical text itself could stimulate so many different types of mentalities within different kinds of cognitive frameworks, symbolic frameworks, and that the culture is spread on this very complex dynamic of authority and creative freedom that is certainly a ceaseless issue. That's one thing, the aspect of historical theology and trying to respect the many stages of canonical forms, how cultures build, how they are reflexive and reactive upon one another, and this ongoing process of daring to create through the creativity of language and integrate from the outside in, not just from the inside out, and to create this kind of dynamic synthesis. It's already evident in Scripture, in the rabbinic Midrash, medieval and particularly mystical commentaries, and more modern, the Hasidic material, things that I've worked on quite intensively, are constantly working from the language as a matrix, scriptural language as a matrix, reassembling those terms, finding new significance of Scripture being a kind of a semiotic field in which language is taken in new directions, and then bringing the experience of the outside world and all of its tensions and all of its questions back in and giving it a Jewish language, so that nothing in the world becomes alien to the open-minded Jewish spirit. It becomes Jewish by being reincorporated through the particular language and the absorption within it, and then not just through the imagination, but being lived out in ritual and traditional manner. So there's a way that those things become very much embodied as people become exemplifications of the text, both in their minds and in their bodies. And these kind of issues are very, very important to me, both as a historian of the history of religion and then as a person being transformed by this material. Well, the question sort of came at a certain point. I couldn't avoid it. I didn't know when I was ready for theology. I kept asking myself, well, when was I going to be pure enough, or going to think clearly enough? And then I realized that never was going to happen. So I figured the only way to do theology was to do theology and to try to write and become pure in the process, or purer, or to think more clearly. And really there was really no other way. It's a kind of a spiritual exercise, and that's really the way I begin the Sacred Attunement, that theology is an ongoing act of a spiritual exercise through reinterpreting, but it requires the daring in a certain sense I should say, part of that issue was, what could I say to my sons? What was the honest statement that I could leave as a heritage of my own? In other words, it's a very easy thing to speak about historical theology and to say, well, they thought this and that, and you don't have to take a stand, and things are this way and things are that way. And then the issue is to say, well, where do I stand? Where do I stand as I get older, moving towards death? Where do I stand as a legacy to my children? What do I want to impart from them? And then, of course, you're faced with this enormous bricolage, this kind of range of sources. And then you're faced, in a certain sense, with what the great people in the tradition were always faced with. Well, how do you make a structure of coherence? How do you make a priority of values? How do you establish, without denying certain things, what becomes primary in your religious life? And how do you live with that in a kind of primary way? And so, in a certain sense, I wanted to model. I originally wrote Sacred Attunement as a letter to my sons, and it was only later that people convinced me that it should be less idiosyncratic and more general. But as a father, the issue is what was the spiritual legacy, and how could you model being a scholar and a religious person at the same time, and how could I model the notion that one could be open to the larger world and still be deeply committed to the compelling and true dimensions of the Jewish religious tradition. So those are primary and important things. But since I was also a scholar of this material, and having become aware that within the ancient Near East, they thought within the categories of the ancient Near East and Midrash within Greco-Roman things, and I was neither a Canaanite nor was I an ancient Israelite, and I'm not from the Roman period or the medieval. So I am where I am. I'm a modern person. So, and I have a different plausibility structure. What is real? What is true for a person who reads other things than traditional texts? So how do you move with that? How could I become clear to myself as to what was the real plausibility issues, so that then when I wanted to integrate the Jewish sources, they would be real and honest. They wouldn't simply be slapping on some medievalist allegory that wasn't mine. Or how could I would be slapping on some medieval commentator and pretending that I was some kind of Maimonidean when I'm not a Maimonidean. I'm in the 20th and 21st century. So whatever that's real, it has to go through a translation filter. And how do you do that? So the process of writing Sacred Attunement really required me, and Sam was hinting at that about going back to primary things. I really felt that to understand what the cognitive and epistemological, the way I was seeing the world was, I had to go back and really rethink some basic things in semiotics, in phenomenology, in the philosophy of nature, the very primary issues in hermeneutics of interpreting and explaining the world, the relation between self and the world, the integration and the relationality between self and world. These became very important things, and not to create a gap between that and the larger theological issues, but to try to move through the clarity of what it means to exist and think about the world, then to understand how the Jewish material would be absolutely real to me. And I wouldn't have to kind of give apologetic explanation. So this issue of honesty was fundamental. In the process of doing sacred attunement, one of the things that became increasingly important to me, and I'll tell you why this has increasingly been of importance, is I became aware of the fundamental significance of 4 structures of the Jewish interpretive or hermeneutical imagination. It's called by the acronym in Hebrew Pardes, which really refers in the Hebrew to Pshat, Remez, Drash, and Sod, but they refer to the fact of the plain contextual sense. It refers to Drash, which is the rabbinic interpretive sense of theology and rabbinic law, and interpreting within a very specific canon of logic and rationality. The Remez, in the philosophical sense, was always a process of spiritual growth, of intellectual perfection, moral perfection, for the person, and not just for the community, which Midrash is for the community, Remez is always for the individual, and Sod is the much more cosmic or ultimate dimension. Well, since I realized that those 4 structures, really symbolic forms of the imagination, structured that, in sacred attunement, I began the process of trying to use those, since I believe that reading, we begin by reading the world, and in addition to reading the world, we read texts. Those provided 4 vectors of importance, and I used that really to develop a kind of spiritual ethics on those 4 levels of what the rules of reading are in rabbinic literature as ways of learning how to see the world through the way that if Torah study and rabbinic study is what the rabbis call an avoda, a spiritual practice, well then part of that spiritual practice is as you read, you're also learning structural ways to engage the world and to think about ethical and other kinds of questions. So I began to move from historical theology to this aspect of what is called around here constructive theology, which is more personal, but not just personal. It can't be idiosyncratic. It has to be something that can be shared in a community, so it can't just be an idiosyncratic formulation. The work prior to this work I was honored to be part of as 15 people of the Living Contemporary Jewish Philosophers series was my commentary on the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim. The reason I mention it is because that became an integration of historical theology and constructive theology, which is to say that I wanted to take one particular text which has a very particular structure of desire, of yearning, of longing, of lack, and growth and transformation across the span from nature to God, but then to see it along the 4 levels of interpretation that were so fundamental for the Jewish historical imagination. So I went through the entire 2,000 years of commentaries in the history of Judaism and tried to kind of reformulate that in modern terms, since we don't think like medievals and we don't think like ancients. So the rabbinic material has to be translated to become religiously real. Otherwise, they're just platitudes. The philosophical, no, we don't live within the world of the active intellect. It's not. And to talk all day and all night about the relationship between the Tiferet and the Shekhinah would be obscene. So it has to be something that really turns this into living religious quality. And I realized at a certain point that the medieval commentators, or the serious religious commentators who wrote, made a choice. They couldn't say everything. Otherwise, you could just have a Rolodex. They made a choice about what were the significant texts, and then they spoke about them from a very serious, personal, integrated point of view. So I wanted to kind of create a new religious language that would be embedded in the history of commentaries, so that you would see the difference between what we call the plain sense or the rabbinic sense and so on. And on the basis of the historical theology, one could then derive a kind of more personal language and see oneself moving along those directions. And I'll close by simply indicating what came to me at that point, which now is the basis of the theology that I'm working on. I realized that we as modern persons, as religious persons or just as persons, don't live at one cognitive level only. And the notion of trying to square the circle or the multiplicity of our lives as religious people by saying it's either X or Y or Z was a folly to the open and complex world that we live in, nor was it a fact of the medievals as well. And so what was important for me is to create a fourfold structure for every single verse, but not to do what the medievals did, to say that there's a hierarchy, that you begin with the plain sense, and you go to the allegorical sense, and then you go to the mystical sense. Or you trivialize X and you say, this is the only real structure. But we live synergistically with multiple levels simultaneously. And what are those four levels? So the pshat, in my own understanding, as it became understood through the Song of Songs commentary, and then in the work that I'm doing now, is the world that we share with all human beings. It's the plain world. It's the contextual world. It's the world that's a universal world of birth and death. It's the world of the creative imagination. In the Song of Songs, it's just the longing for relationship, the longing for love, the longing for fulfillment, the awareness of the evanescence of things, the way things change, that life is constructed around speech and dialogue. There are many other aspects of that pshat level, but what it really means is things that I share with anybody, anywhere, insofar as people are human beings, and insofar as I am a living person, I'm embedded in that language. Then there's that second level that affects the Song of Songs, but that affects oneself as a religious person, and that is I am not just a person in the world as any kind of a person. I am a person, it's not just kind of a general hermeneutic, I have a cultural hermeneutic. I'm a person who's made a commitment to a specific culture that requires a very specific logic, a specific language, a specific form of behavior. The rabbinic path and the rabbinic system of thinking and the way of organizing the world, the way of thinking through text, the way of ritualizing and living a serious religious life means that one is embedded in a certain circuit of language, a certain kind of commitment to community, a certain kind of way of living at the cultural level, and understanding that that is in attention with my universal self just as a normal person. And that's always going to be attention, but it has to remain because that level is going to impact changes and affect me as a religious person. But there's already a tension that one cannot deny, because you can't live any kind of life. You also have to have the discipline to live a specific kind of life, or you can't go very far with that. And so there's a commitment to the cultural aspect. The reinterpretation of Remez, the philosophical or spiritual or moral allegory, takes shape with the realization that great cultures, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, are not only cultural forms for the community in which the language is to try to embed practice and thought within the community, but it leaves space within the language of the culture for personal spiritual exploration. How does the self move within its own desires, with its own yearnings, with its own moral compass? And what are the resources, say, within Judaism for what we call spiritual practice, purification, mindfulness, or whatever? There's a huge literature of that, but that's not simply a kind of vague language. It has to be done within the authenticity of that cultural language as it becomes honed, but it's also, again, also in tension with my particular self in the world. And finally, I'm not just an individual in a culture, which I have to make a commitment to that, to live in a certain kind of directed way, even though some things get lost in the translation and in the process. I'm also a person in the cosmos. in which the entire world of persons and nature and culture, in all of its vastness, interpenetrate. And that requires its own symbolic language. In Judaism, certainly the mystical language is its own language. So the point is that all of these are synergistically, at certain points, different combinations come together. At certain points, they move. Sometimes that can only be in one aspect at one time. But we live complexly. We have multiform minds. We live in multiform influences. And I wanted to develop a theology that would do that. So the commentary in the Song of Songs was an attempt to begin that process of integrating historical and constructive theology through one vector of one text, but to see what it means to grow and to think in relationship with persons, with God and community, with the inner self, with the interconnectedness of all being in a certain way, and that is really part of the framework of the theology that I'm trying to work out. So in a certain sense, that's the legacy I wanted to give my sons. The legacy I want to leave my students is that one can live an integrated, or struggle for an integrated life between all of these things. One has to move between the honesty of the otherness of historical sources and a personal appropriation, and work out the right kinds of integrity. Because otherwise, in the end of the day, the work of historical theology as culture is simply books that add some information, but they're on the shelf. Culture works on the ground, and it works through practice and oral transmission. So at the end of the day, everybody has to be constructive for the culture to continue. The culture doesn't simply continue by the library of Borges's Library of Babel. That's there. But the question is the interiorization of these libraries in a living, dynamic way. So that's what I'm a little bit about, and thank you very much. I know if people wanted to have some questions or just roam around. Yeah? Or leave. Yeah.
You mentioned a commitment to your own culture, and you mentioned nature and the cosmos. I'm wondering, do you find any sources in any other human cultures other than Judaism that have been meaningful to you?
Well, you know, the whole process of reading, I would like to say, in the old Latin adage, nothing human is alien to me, as much as possible. I try to be aware of as many religions and forms of creativity as I can, and to try to do that in the language of that. I think I realized at a certain point, and it came to me maybe through wisdom, that you have to choose one language that's the most resonant one. And despite a lot of rebellious stages that we all had or I've had, I finally realized that for better or for worse, Judaism is the true resonant language, and things have to be brought back into that for them to be a living process. I think everybody has to do that within their own choice of those things. So the answer is, of course, yes, to the best of my ability. I try to do that, and to keep the cognitive canon open of my mind, so that one can be aware of multiple forms of the imagination. That's part of what triggered with you from the very beginning with the seer and symbolic forms. That the multiplicity of imaginative truth in the world is vast and astonishing, and it's awesome. And it's part of the world that God created in the imagination. And so not to pay attention to that would to turn one's own tradition into an idol. And so the issue is to try to keep all of that in a kind of living tension.
I have two questions.
Maybe you can one.
So the first is your work on hermeneutical theology converse in any way, if so to what extent, with other modern theological forms? in Christianity or Islam? And the second, what is the next step? I mean, it clearly does converse with modern philosophical thought, philosophy, in other branches of it.
I think I'm trying to create my own. Yeah, the question is, how does this fit into other theological or other forms of thought? I'm trying to create my own personal synthesis. There are fragments of a lot of this that I've learned from across the spectrum, from general philosophy and beyond that, and Jewish and Christian and Islamic thought to some degree. But I'm trying to create my own real dynamic. I think a lot more emphasis now I'm trying to put on is to really develop a kind of, I've become clearer to myself about a theology of nature and the natural world and how that builds up to the larger relationship to the world of Judaism and Torah, and how that relates to finding a spiritual path within that. So it's my own particular integration. Ultimately, I think that the hardest path, and for those of you who are trying this, or even who write poetry, do other kinds of things, the early formulations are, to be honest, or when I first wrote Sacred Attunement, to be honest, it would have to be written, I believe that theology has to be written like a prayer. It has to, you have to stand behind every word. You have to be able to make a commitment to this, so that you can't just say, well, I sort of meant that, and this is where I stand. You have to put up your theses on your own gates of Wittenberg, I guess, and you have to say, help me, it's the only, what I have to do. But there's a danger that that language becomes idiosyncratic. It's a private language. The most honest language is a private language. And so the great struggle, and I think probably it might have been different in the medieval period where you have more standardized theological, philosophical language, but for a modern person who's affected by so many other languages, so many other ways of expressibility, how do you keep what is unique to the creativity of the self, that a poet would create a new language so that you break open the routinization of mental and linguistic categories? How do you do that and then stay connected to traditional language and language form? So that balance between the idiosyncratic and what can become more liturgical and shared is not an easy one, and I'm still working at that. I sort of descend into private language, but I still believe very much that the same way that Kafka said that his stories are really all prayers. Rabbi Nachman also had this same. Rabbi Nachman was one of the great Jewish Hasidic theologians in the early part of the 19th century. He gave a different twist. Kafka said, from his point of view, that his writing has to become a prayer. That's to say that there's a kind of integrity and purpose of that. Rabbi Nachman gave a very interesting twist. Maybe it's a Jewish twist, but he said that a person's Torah, let's say their own interpretation, has to become life. You have to turn that back into life, and that going to then the particular hermeneutical interpretation then has to become livable in a kind of a real, more solidified way. So I have one hand touches Kafka, the other hand touches Rabbi Nachman.
I really, I'm a student of Christianity, but your class on Jewish spiritual practices was one of my favorite at the Jewish school. So, but I'm thinking about this. This is very helpful for me as someone who is trying to embody or make community from a tradition, and who I've had some mentors who were strongly influenced by Karl Barth, which, he's not a big person here, but I was wondering if it seems like what you're doing is helpful for me. Like, you talked a lot about integration. For me, the problem with Barth, and I don't know if there's what the Jewish equivalent, is there a Jewish equivalent of Karl Barth in the 20th century? Because it seems like you might be another path.
There are, but that kind of dialectical thinking is not really...
That's not really the... But what I'm wondering is is it that these four different levels or domains of the self and of is there a way to talk about how they're related, or is it that they just are, they're different parts of who we are, and it's about acknowledging
the task
them?
is to create that relatedness.
Yeah, and how
To feel in the most experiential way what it means to walk on the earth, and then to feel the cultural difference between that and one's commitment to a culture. There's a lot that's lost, there's a lot that's gained. To understand that, for example, just so you can say, I mean, the paradoxes are so numerous within Judaism, but you say, well, at one level, the Jewish day is affected by the sun, right, in terms of particular times, right, of prayer time. And yet there are lots of ways in which the time before the Sabbath begins before and goes extended. In others, there are paradoxical relations where you become aware that culture is a construction over nature. And one has to integrate that tension between nature or the natural world and culture, and what it means to live in the interface between the two. And then what's gained and what's lost with a personal path. You can't meditate in multiple languages, right? So you have to make, yeah. So, from that point of view, you have the commitment of faith is the commitment that the hermeneutical tradition won't distort your soul, that will lead you somewhere, right? That it will bring you somewhere, and then how that becomes integrated into a more cosmic spirituality that the Kabbalah, or in different psychological ways, Hasidism works. I think one has to feel the difference between these languages and the interpenetration, because some of them work for certain spiritual and cultural things, but there's always a point of tension. And I think that space is the space of religious freedom and the space of growth and the space of responsibility. As if you don't feel that space, you get locked into ideological or idolatrous structures. And to realize what is true from a historical theological point of view of these multiple levels that are homologous but not quite, and there's no simple looking down through a hologram. But one has to try to live that in multiple forms. And obviously at certain points some things predominate over others. But to be that complex self, but you have to have a starting point. The starting point has to be the relationship to kind of shared communal tradition. So the private language or the language of nature is not solipsistic and isolated. So that becomes Sinai, becomes fundamental.
So could you say that this process of negotiating or navigating the tensions itself is part of the spiritual path?
That is part of the spiritual exercise.
That's cool.
Right. Well, I mean, one would think about it, just think about the normal practice of prayer, right? So not all sentences make sense anymore. If it's an ancient Near Eastern, or it can make sense, right? So then, at what point are you aware that a rabbinic topos has entered into the meaning of that word? Or that you're aware that between one word and another there is this vast open space, and you're not sure whether the meaning is conveyed by the language at the surface or the light behind it, or which becomes ground and which is surface, which is ground, and you're constantly in this process of realizing that the contemplative nature of prayer, what the rabbis call iyun tefillah, which is one of the ideals that we begin the service with, is this meditative notion of moving from one word to another through the spaces of the language, and that becomes a spiritual realization that what one does or accepts mentally is a risk and a hope. But it's not the only way, and it may change in another mood. So So for me, that is both the freedom that's given hermeneutically, but it's also spiritual task that prevents the idolatry of the spirit, which for me that is the core issue between divine freedom and human tendency towards idolatry as a core issue, right from the very beginning of the first two commandments.
Would Hebrew Bible give any meaning when you're outside of Jewish tradition?
Yes, yes. You're right to ask that question. It's very, of course, the traditional answer would be I can't read scripture except through the tradition, right? And that is true at one level. It's at level of midrash. But it has meaning for me at two levels. One is to fully understand the teachings and the ground against which the rabbinic imagination is working. It has truth on its own, but it's the truth over against the struggle with its meaning, because there's no simple fundamental sense of the text at any level, even at that plain sense level, and to become aware of what tradition you're bringing to the construction of meaning. I think that on its own, but
that was not my question. I understand Hebrew Bible has a meaning even within the Jewish tradition.
But
that was not the question.
Okay.
The question is, if you ignore Jewish tradition, or well, the core of Jewish tradition, would Hebrew Bible for you still have a meaning as a collection of texts?
But then I wouldn't be Jewish.
You may not 90% of Jews in the United States have never read Hebrew Bible.
Look, the question is, if you take your stand as a Jew, the full embodiment of 1,000 years of diverse interpretation is that form of acceptance. I think it's very important that when the scripture is read in the synagogue, it's read without commentaries. It's simply read out. But the reception is the reception of an ongoing community of listeners, and that is a fundamental Jewish stance. The text without the community would deprive me of the historical community of that text. So I wouldn't know what that text was, since I wasn't standing at Sinai in any historical sense. That's the only honest answer I can give. So if you want to continue more, I'm here. I'm delighted to have shared this with you, and I thank you so much for coming. And if I don't know you and you'd like to say hello, please come on. I suppose these are here and there. I don't know if the Song of Songs is on the around, but maybe.